Hello, and today we're going to answer the question of to what extent were the leaders of Europe to blame for World War I? This is a highly contested question by historians. It is hotly debated and is very controversial and probably unanswerable because there are a lot of factors related to World War I, and the leaders obviously played a particular part. We're going to look at a few of them today. It's going to be a very rushed and complicated look at the major political leaders of the major participants of World War I, the asterisks being that we're going to focus on the heads of state and not on generals, because there are a lot of people obviously in the beginning of the war, and we don't want to overwhelm ourselves, and we need to evaluate whether or not these leaders wanted war or not. So a few things to note right out the gate. The first is to say that a lot of these people are from the old world. Obviously World War I was in 1914, which means that these people lived most of their lives in the 1800s, meaning that they had that kind of old world mindset, which is to say that they often believed in monarchical rule, the divine right to rule, imperial expansion, opposition to different countries, that sort of thing. Many of them were related. The quote-unquote happy family for Europe was very much true in this case, and that is no more exemplified than in the relationship between Kaiser Wilhelm II, who's on the left in the image, George V in the middle, and then Tsar Nicholas II on the right, who were all cousins. And they're not the only ones in Europe who were related to each other, but this was very much a family affair as well as a geopolitical one. The final thing to say is that a lot of the political leaders believed that the war, if war was to begin, would only be potentially between a few countries, and that it would be pretty short. And it wouldn't certainly lead to a whole European war, a continental war, and definitely not a world war. Obviously, that was not the case. So the narrative at the time, perpetuated by the Allied forces, was that the Germans were to blame for the war, and that they were the ones who had to bear the brunt of the blame for it. And there was a lot of propaganda at the time which was anti-German. As you can see, there are some images of that here. Whether or not that's true, we will have a look at, but over time, historians have started to, by and large, change their view away from kind of sole German responsibility. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through the different countries of the war, and we're going to talk about the heads of state. I'm going to give you a little bit of information, and on your sheet you need to write the name of the person and then one piece of information about them. So beginning, we have George V, who was the King of Britain at the time, and he was quite a conservative man. He was quite quiet. He acted as the figurehead for Great Britain and the Allied forces during the war, but he never was that keen on public life. He wasn't actually meant to be king, and he never forgave Germany for beginning the war. He believed that his cousin, the Kaiser, was the main kind of person who began the war, and he wrote in his journal when the war began that the war is a terrible catastrophe, but it is not our fault. And in fact, during the war, he changed his name for his royal house from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, which sounds very German because it is Germanic in origin, to Windsor because that sounded more British, and he got a lot of pushback from his people about sounding too German because anti-German sentiment was rife at the time. He faced a few internal crises, but overall, that is him. Of course, Britain is a constitutional monarchy, and along with the king comes some different prime ministers. So Herbert Asquith was the person in charge when the war broke out, and he was a fairly respected old world leader. He was Edwardian in the sense that he was quite he was both progressive and also conservative, certainly in the modern sense of the word, but he did certain things like introduce a kind of people's tax, which was controversial, and he had a couple of different scandals which eventually led him out of government, and he passed a conscription bill in England at the time, which he was reluctant to do, but still, obviously it meant that more soldiers were joining the fight in 1916. And then David Lloyd George, who was his kind of main opposition, he came onto the scene later in the war, and he is mostly remembered for being a kind of post-war prime minister and helping to shape Europe after World War I. He did do things like help create the Royal Air Force, the RAF, which was obviously a significant kind of force, militarily speaking, but he is known as what we call one of the big three, which is to say one of the major three leaders of the three countries which were dominating post-war discussions at the time and ultimately shaped things like the Treaty of Versailles. He was also Welsh, and he was the only Welsh Prime Minister to ever have been in the UK. On to France. We have a president and a prime minister. The president is a man named Raymond Poincaré, and he was obviously throughout the whole of the First World War the president, as you can see there. And he, at the beginning of the war, he basically said that something would reign called the Union Sacrée, which it was more or less a political truce where all parties, regardless of ideology, would come together and focus on the war effort for the sake of France. That worked, but as you can see by the fact that there are several different prime ministers following him, not all of whom have pictured, there was still a lot of political controversy. There was a lot of strife in France at the time, and there were a lot of issues, largely because they were one of the major fronts of the war and their territory was being encroached upon by the Germans. So he also introduced the 3 years law. So France already had conscription universally for all men, and it was 2 years, but he increased it to 3 in order to sort of get people to be able to fight for longer. So that was him. And famously, after the war, he occupied the Rhine, which was an area in Germany which helped eventually lead to animosity and then the rise of fascism in the 30s. So after him, there's a whole series of different prime ministers, and the final prime minister at the end of the war is a man named Georges Clemenceau. And Clemenceau is another one of the big three. He was called the Tiger. He was really aggressively anti-German and pro-French, and he helped shape the punishment on the Germans at the end of the war. On to Russia. We have one main Tsar. Tsar is just another word for like the king, and that is Tsar Nicholas II, who is a very, very controversial figure. He was ousted in the Russian Revolution of 1917, and he was replaced by a man named Vladimir Lenin and the communist government, which you have probably heard of. Now, Tsar Nicholas was regarded as pretty incompetent as a ruler. He had a lot of controversy, notably his kind of public perception with this guy called Rasputin, who you may have heard of, who was a priest monk who had joined his kind of close circle of people in his royal court, and the Russian population did not like it all. And he led a massive military force, but a really undersupplied one. So Russia wasn't very industrialized. It was industrializing at this point, and he pushed a lot of people into war when they didn't have equipment and when they were reluctant to fight. He actually took over as the head of the army to try and boost morale by being the king, kind of coming out to inspect troops. That completely backfired because there was so much sort of hate for the Tsar at this point, and it helped lead to the Russian Revolution. Lenin, I won't talk about too much, but he was the communist leader who then replaced Tsar Nicholas II. He actually had him shot and kind of stabbed in a basement, and he signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk because the Russian people were largely anti-war, which is one of the reasons why Lenin managed to come into power. And that treaty pulled Russia out of the war by 1918, which meant that they weren't really involved in participating in post-war things. They weren't invited to the Paris peace treaties. But someone who was, and was another one of our big three, was a man named Woodrow Wilson, who was the president of the United States of America all throughout World War I. He entered the war in April 1917 because of two things. One called the Zimmerman Telegram, which was basically a German telegram sent to Mexico to say, Mexico, if you join in the war, then we will give you Texas potentially. And also the implementation of unrestricted submarine warfare by the German people, which led to some different tragedies that brought Wilson into the war. He had a lot of controversy around entering the war, and he sort of pulled the public into it, but ultimately the American presence was so extremely significant in the winning of the war for the Allies because of the resources and the troops that they were able to provide, and economically speaking, they were quite large. This was how they grew to be the major world power that we know today. And Wilson was one of the big three at the end of the war who advocated for something called the League of Nations, which was the precursor to the UN. Italy is our next country, and Victor Emmanuel III, he was known as the Little King because he was about 5 feet tall. He had a sort of leg defect which caused him to not grow massively tall. And he was the one who advocated shifting from neutrality to an alliance with the Triple Entente. So if you remember, Italy was a partner in the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary. The next man who we'll talk about, Antonio Salandra, argued that actually, because of the nature of the war, Italy didn't have to go in and fight alongside Austria-Hungary and Germany, so they declared neutrality. And it was Victor Emmanuel who pushed for talks in London to get Italy on the side of the Allies and the Entente in May 1915 in order to potentially get some territorial gains from Austria at the end of the war. His prime minister was Antonio Salandra to begin with, who advocated for that neutrality, but also resigned after different military failures because Italy had a lot of issues during the First World War. Then it ended with a man named Vittorio Orlando, who was the prime minister at the end of World War I. And I've said there he was one of the big four. You would note I said big three before. The big four is another term for it because technically Italy was another one of the partners, but Italy was not treated the same at all. So a lot of people just say the big three. And he did not quite manage to achieve the level of success that he wanted within that. It is worth saying while we're here that Victor Emmanuel III, after the war, he supported Mussolini, and eventually that helped lead to the rise of fascism in Italy at the time. In Australia, coming home, we had a couple of prime ministers. The first one was Andrew Fisher, who was there right at the outset of the war, but the second and most prominent one was a man named Billy Hughes during World War I. And Billy Hughes is a really interesting figure. He was aggressively pro-British, so he said famously that we promised Britain 50,000 troops, and he really pushed to support the empire and in the defeat of the Germans. So that anti-German sentiment, it was present in Australia as well, and you would know, hopefully, that parts of Australia South Australia especially, were particularly German, and there were some issues at the time regarding that because of the anti-German sentiment. But within that want to introduce or give Britain that 50,000 troops, he introduced a referendum for conscription in 1916 in Australia, which did end up failing, which is why we don't have conscription. But that's Billy Hughes. He was pro-British. He really pushed to support them. He drove the war effort. He was also extremely racist, which is par for the course for a lot of these leaders, but it is significant, especially because of Australia's sort of white Australia policy and different things like that. Moving to Japan, we have the Emperor Taisho, whose real name was Yoshihito, and he was the emperor who succeeded Emperor Meiji, who began what was called the Meiji era, the Meiji Restoration, where he aimed to industrialize Japan. It was the idea of speed up and get ahead, so kind of catch up to Europe in terms of technology and progress and whatnot, and then exceed them. Japan at the time was imperialist in terms of their mindset. They wanted to expand. They had Korea and they also had Taiwan, and they wanted to continue expanding, including into a variety of different Pacific islands, which Germany had colonized, and they were promised if they joined the war that they would get these islands from Germany. So Meiji was the initial one leading on to Yoshihito, who succeeded him and then entered the war on the Allied side. It is interesting, I put two pictures of him there intentionally, one on the left in kind of European military uniform and one on the right in sort of traditional Japanese uniform in order to show sort of the cultural contrast at the time. Moving to Belgium, we have Albert I, who was known as the Soldier King. Albert was a really beloved leader and quite celebrated by the annals of history. He fought alongside his troops. He defended Belgium after it was invaded by the Germans, breaking the neutrality. And when 80 to 90% of the land of Belgium was occupied by Germany, he stayed in that last bit and he defended it with his men. He also flooded large areas of land as a kind of way of trying to prevent German advancement. And even though that did actually lead to, in the post-war, kind of a lot of disease and death because of stagnant water and kind of destruction and that sort of thing, he is still revered as a really good leader of Belgium at the time. who supported his country during crisis. Peter I was the leader of Serbia. Now, Peter I is interesting because he got sick and he remained the king. He was called Peter the Liberator. He remained the king of Serbia, but he ended up kind of having his duties overtaken by his son, Alexander I, which is why I've put him there. And he took up all royal roles, including being the Supreme General of the Serbian army. But technically, Peter was kind of the figurehead. He supported the war for his troops. He rallied them. He visited troops. And ultimately, he kind of helped with morale and that sort of thing, while Alexander was involved in strategy. Moving from the Allies to the other side, we have Austria-Hungary and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We have a few different people to talk about who we have already talked about. Franz Ferdinand, who of course famously triggered the July crisis that led to World War I on the 20th of June when he was assassinated in Sarajevo. He was quite a conservative man. He believed in the monarchy, and within that, obviously, he was opposed by the Pan-Slavists who eventually killed him, leading to the war. The actual emperor of Austria-Hungary was a man named Franz Joseph, who was quite old. He began his rule in 1848, so he was the longest ruling monarch at the time in Europe who was still alive, and he was the same as his nephew. He was quite monarchical. He believed in his right to rule. He was quite aggressive in his policy. He was also having to pull together a lot of different strings of the empire. For example, he had to deal with Hungary and some different economic crises, and he had to ensure that his power base was there in a very culturally diverse empire. So it was quite difficult. He did die in 1916, which led to his successor, Charles I, kind of coming in only for a couple of years because the war obviously finished, and then Austria-Hungary was dissolved and the empire collapsed. But while he was there, unfortunately, he ruled during a time of crisis. It was in the middle of the war. Things weren't going particularly well, obviously, towards the end of the war. And there were a lot of different sort of political and economic crises, which led to the dissolution of the monarchy in the end during the Paris peace treaties. Looking at Germany, we have Kaiser Wilhelm II leading the charge as the head of the German monarchy, but then they also had a chancellor. So Kaiser Wilhelm is a really, really fascinating figure, and the one who a lot of blame for the war is put upon. That's probably not deserved, but it is worth saying that he was famously anti-British. He was, of course, massively imperialist, wanting a place in the sun, and he did, which is the clincher, he offered the blank check to Austria-Hungary, which was basically a confirmation that Austria-Hungary would receive military support from Germany regardless of any particular political situation, which then emboldened Austria-Hungary to invade, to declare war on Serbia, which led to the continuation of the July crisis and the end of the beginning of World War I. What the Kaiser wanted, which is one of his biggest defences, is that he advocated for a halt at Belgrade. He only wanted the war to be into Serbia, and he would support Austria-Hungary in that, but he didn't want troop advancement to go beyond that, which would bring, Russia into the war more, and then France, and then lead to, obviously, what happened in World War I. That didn't happen. He was aggressive. He was quite a loud and outspoken member. Whether or not it's fair to say that he was the main perpetrator of the war, it's difficult to say, but he certainly shouldn't bear all of the blame. As an interesting fact as well, and perhaps a cause of that outspokenness and that imperialist attitude, and maybe even a little bit of an inferiority complex leading to wanting to expand and grow a really good empire, was that he had an affected arm. It was kind of because of the way that he was born, his arm was affected and forever sort of semi-paralyzed. And he had a really bad relationship with his mother, who famously called him a cripple, said that he was unbelievably lazy and slovenly. And what I think is pretty damning is she said that he has nothing of me, which is to say, he resembles nothing about her. So perhaps if we look into the psychology of figures during war, then maybe the childhood with his mother could have led to some of these things. Who knows? He was also cousins, of course, with George V and Nick II, which both of these monarchs had really strong, historic, powerful empires. So the Kaiser wanted something like that. And he also had a chancellor who was called Bethmann Hollweg, and the chancellor did not want war. He did a lot of different things to sort of prevent it, but at the same time, he also was involved in talks around giving the blank check to Austria-Hungary. So he's another quite controversial figure, but ultimately he sought to stop the war before it began through some different talks with Britain and whatnot, and he didn't manage it at all. And he was opposed largely by Erich Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg, who were two military leaders who eventually Hindenburg overtook him as chancellor. And they were really pro-war, and they opposed him, which was a little bit of a shame because, of course, World War I happened and a lot of people died. The Ottoman Empire was led by Sultan Mehmed V, who unfortunately came in 1909 at a time when the empire was already collapsing. And he came in, the First and then Second Balkan Wars happened just like near the start of his reign, and it led to a further shrinking of his land in Northern Africa and in Eastern Europe. And by the time World War I rolls around, the Ottoman Empire is already looking pretty small and weak, honestly. There is a Minister for War called Enver Pasha who is in the Ottoman cabinet, and he really advocates and pushes for war. He is the one, pretty much exclusively, who leads the Ottoman Empire into war, joining in October of 1914. And they join in a way that a lot of people think is quite rushed, but they believe that if they win the war, that they can get back some territory from Russia. So that is the story there. Finally, Bulgaria under Tsar Ferdinand I comes into the war in October of 1915, believing that if they do win the war, then they'll get some territory from Serbia. He's quite a kind of politically controversial figure in that he had some good parts and some bad parts, and there were some economic crises and that sort of thing. Eventually, his son took over for him and withdrew the Bulgarians from the war just before it ended in September of 1918, and it eventually led to the dissolution of the monarchy there. So that's all of the countries, allies and central powers of World War I and their political leaders. So I suppose the question is, based on that information and the historical events that happened, were they responsible for World War I? It's complicated. The leaders of World War I were largely focused upon territorial gain and the expansion of their militaries in the lead up to the conflict. When their interests went against those of their neighbours, it drew Europe closer to war. Importantly, no leader explicitly wanted a European war, and many did try to prevent it. Only Franz Joseph really was the one who wanted war with Serbia, and then Germany said they would support them. But the whole climate at the time, because of nationalism, imperialism, and all of that, it eventually, unfortunately, led to the conflict that we know today. All of that said, even though no one wanted war, and a lot of people did try to prevent it, like Bethmann Hollweg, troops were promised by people like Australia. Neutrality was broken by Italy and they joined the conflict, and various actors joined the war mainly for personal gain. So Bulgaria wanted some stuff in Serbia, Italy wanted some of Austria's territory, Japan wanted the Pacific Islands, the Ottomans wanted stuff from Russia, and Austria-Hungary eventually wanted Serbia. And only Belgium, that was the only country which was truly, honestly defending itself after its neutrality was broken. And then obviously Britain came into the war to defend them. So it's a really tough question and there's no right or wrong answer, but hopefully this video has given you some food for thought on the names and faces of the leaders of World War I and ultimately their responsibility within starting the conflict.